Our story starts in 1901 in Cascais, Portugal. The sun filtered through a sizable dirty window, casting a soft glow on rows of tables laden with ungutted cod. Tony Dominguez, a 23-year-old lean man, stood beside his best friend and fellow worker Rico Benito, but everyone just called him Benito. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of fish and sweat. The men were covered in fish slime as they expertly gut and salt the fish, ready for crating. Tony angrily called Benito, "These are the last of these slimy bottom dwellers for gutting and salting. When we finish, do you want to head down to Carlo's Cafe and have a couple of drinks?" With an exhausting sigh, Benito yelled, "If I can get the smell of cod off me." After they cleaned up, Benito and Tony headed down a cobblestone alley toward their only hour of fun before heading home for a short night's sleep. Benito wanted Tony to know that if their lives continue as they are, they will end up like all the other elders in the village, poor, old, just sitting around in some dilapidated hut waiting to die. If that's the life we're headed for, we might as well give up and die now. Tony replied, "I've been thinking the same way. You realize, Benito, we come to work before the sun rises and leave after the sun goes down 6 days a week, and we barely make enough money to survive. While those lazy, no-good aristocrats come to this beautiful town, live in their expensive villas, treat us peasants like pigs, go their way in the winter months, return in the spring, and complain about how tough their lives are." Benito agreed. "I've been thinking lately, it's time we figured out a way out of this horrible life. I've heard so much about a country called America, where a person can build his life and live how he wants. The steamer sailors have told me so much about this new land. They say you can live where you want, any way you want, not like here. As you know, Tony, you must now get papers to move across town, so the government knows where to find you when it's time to pay your last dollar in taxes. I'm sure you've heard, there's another storm brewing. Some say that a civil war is coming, and if that happens, we either must go to war and fight for this monarch butcher, or they'll imprison us." Tony told Benito, "That's one fight I'm not going to get involved in." The two finished their last sip of wine and agreed to meet again in a couple of days to start planning how to leave Portugal for America. When Tony got to the shack on the side of his Uncle Jorge's goat barn, he lay down on his cot and tried to close his eyes to attempt to get some sleep before it was time to rise and head for another round of endless fish cleaning and packing. As he laid down, he realized sleep would not come quickly tonight, with thoughts running through his head about leaving the beautiful country he loved. He laid there, remembering the days of living with his father and grandfather up in the hilly area of the country where the vineyards flourished. The days when his grandfather was the master of the land, and his father ran the crews that harvested the succulent bounty of grapes that made some of the best wines in Europe. In his mind, it was almost like he had relived those days again. As quickly as those beautiful thoughts ran through his mind, he thought about the greedy governing monarchs that started bringing in cheap labourers from southern Africa while simultaneously driving out the Portuguese workers that had tended the orchards for generations. Tony continued to remember the people erupting all over Portugal as the word spread that slavery was once again in their land. He also recalled the monarchs spreading lies that these Africans only needed a chance for work because of the hardships in their own countries. The government consciously didn't tell the people that these foreign workers were working for less than half the wages of the previous Portuguese workers. As he tossed and turned, trying to fall asleep, he realized there would be no sleep tonight, because he thought of being with his father and grandfather while being young, happy, and naive. He suddenly remembered the day his grandfather was beaten to death by workers while telling them they must work harder for less money. The beating was not warranted. Unknowingly, his grandfather had just argued with no success for the landowners not to take any more advantage of people that had nothing. When his father found his grandfather's body, the workers came after him, almost killing him. After his father's recovery, Tony recalled his father telling him he was sending him to his Uncle Jorge, who lived in a small fishing village about 200 kilometers from the vineyards. His father also warned him that he was being sent there for safety. After leaving at 12, Tony never saw or heard from his father. Across the village, Benito lay tossing and turning in his sleeping cot in a small hut beside a barn 2 kilometers from town. Like Tony, he started reliving his younger days and how his father encouraged him to get an education in hopes that one day he might escape the squalor the rest of the villagers had to endure. Although brighter than most in the village, Benito realized his advanced education would never happen because of the cost only government landowners could afford for their children. As he nodded off, smiling at things to come, he was awakened by the sound of a rooster crowing and knew he'd better get moving for the long day ahead. When Tony arrived at work, Benito pointed at Tony, giving him a thumbs up to say they would only be doing this for a short time. Tony smiled, raising his hand with that same gesture back. After that day, Tony and Benito met daily at the cantina to plan what would affect their lives in a way they could never have imagined. Benito was sitting at a corner table when Tony walked up, setting down his red wine. Benito, smiling, greeted Tony and started the conversation with, "I hope you are as excited about heading for a new life as much as I've been for the past 2 days." Tony raised his glass, gesturing in agreement with everything Benito said. Benito told Tony he had a conversation yesterday with a fisherman, a sailor on a cargo steamer that brought sugarcane from Brazil for over 5 years. This guy explained that the ships always looked for new workers who stoked the boiler with coal. He also told me that it pays well, but the catch is that it's a 2-man job that does not let up for the 2-week voyage. He said you must keep the fire burning when you sign up until you reach the ship's destination or forfeit a portion of your pay. Tony, young and excited about heading out of the grips of a tyrannical government, raised his glass again without questioning any of the pitfalls of such a change in their lives. The following Sunday was the only free day from the endless fish smell of the packing factory, and Tony went to his uncle Jorge's house to explain his and Benito's plans for a new life. After briefly telling his uncle of their plans, Jorge said, "If I were young again, I'd sail with you. For a young man, not going after challenges in life is a waste of one's youth. You two can't change the world, but you have time for an adventure that will last forever." Jorge also informed them that it was a 2-day ride from Cascais to the shipping port, where the ships sail for Brazil, and that he would take them there when they were ready. A month after their first conversation at Carlo's cafe, all the plans for leaving for Brazil were in place. Jorge had contacted Hidalgo, a friend at the shipping port, who told Jorge there were jobs aboard a steamer leaving for Brazil in a few days. The plan was that the following Sunday, Tony and Benito would pick up their pay from the paymaster and head to Jorge's home, where everything would be packed onto his wagon and they would be ready to head for the shipping port immediately. Although there were restrictions for leaving the village without permission from the village council, the 3 decided to go without telling anyone of their departure, which could cause them to be reprimanded and fined if caught. Tony and Benito arrived at Jorge's house, where he was waiting for their journey immediately. The boys got on the wagon and embarked on a life-changing adventure that none of them could have ever expected. As daylight faded, the 3 encountered a guard barrier on the road ahead. Jorge told the boys let him do the talking, and by no means do you say a word. Just nod your head if you're asked any questions. They slowed down to stop at a barrier blocking the road. A man dressed in uniform stepped out from behind the side guardhouse, walked up to the wagon and asked, "Do you have your permission papers to be on the road?" Jorge tells the guard, "I'm taking these 2 young men to the mission in the next town, to leave them with the priest at the church, in hopes of teaching them how to communicate without speaking." He continued explaining to the guard that the boys were born without speaking, and he had been told that the priest could teach them to communicate using their hands. The guard said, "If you have no papers, I can't let you continue, and you must turn around." Suddenly, a strange sensation came over him. He pulled the barrier aside and said to Jorge, "I sure hope the priest can help those 2 young men." The man then waved them through. Jorge, confused, stared blankly at the guard as he drove past the barrier. They drove all night and managed to arrive at the seaport early. Jorge took them to Hidalgo's house, introduced the boys to Hidalgo. Then he wished them a good voyage, told them to keep in touch, and headed home. After Jorge left, Hidalgo made breakfast for Tony and Benito. While sitting at the table, Hidalgo told the boys that he would need to take them to the ship hiring office and introduce them to Roberto, the man in charge of hiring for the steamer ships. He also told the boys they would need papers to leave the ship when they arrived in Brazil. Hidalgo continued, "We must get your articles in order today, because the ship sails tomorrow afternoon. We need to visit another friend, Mr. Corleone, who forges documents for any occasion." After finishing their meal, Hidalgo went with the two down to the street to meet the paper forger. Once the two were introduced to Mr. Corleone, he informed them that he would have their papers ready first thing in the morning, costing 500 reis. Benito shouted, "We only had 70 reis between us. We had no idea we needed paperwork to get off the ship, and 500 reis would be impossible." Donato Corleone asked, "How important is it that you want to get on a vessel for Brazil?" Tony interrupted, "We will do anything to be on that ship tomorrow." Mr. Corleone responded, "You're not going to like this, but if it's that important, you can pay the 70 reis now and pledge your salary for keeping the ship's boilers going. The hiring boss will pay me 100 reis directly and will give you your paperwork once you've fulfilled your duties. The additional 400 reis plus 100 reis interest will need to be paid by working in one of the Portuguese-owned factories." Benito shouted, "That sounds like slavery." Mr. Corleone said, "Take it or leave it. That's the deal. And it looks like it's the only one you two runaways have. Just think about the consequences of returning to Cascais, facing the council, and having no hope of getting a job again." Tony said, "Escaping the tyranny of Portugal's monarchy government is worth any price we'll need to pay." Benito replied, "Where do we sign for a chance at a life of freedom?" Chapter 2. Stoke the Furnace. The following day, Tony and Benito were up early, thanked Hidalgo for his hospitality, and headed for Mr. Corleone's office to sign their agreement and pick up the forged documents. When they arrived, Mr. Corleone explained that the paperwork had already been sent to the captain and would be given to them after they had completed their 3 months of servitude. After boarding the ship, they were taken down its stairwell to the boiler room and introduced to 2 shovels, wheelbarrows, and a massive pile of coal. A crew member of the ship said, "There is a barrel of water for drinking and washing the sweat off your body by the door. Next to the barrel is a pea pot. Someone will come down twice daily and exchange the pot for another." Jose, the ship's boiler master, explained, "The 2 boilers' temperatures must be kept at a specific level to enable them to force the pistons to engage the propeller. If the temperature falls below the required level, the ship will stop, and it could take an hour or more to build up enough steam to push the ship again." He continued, sounding even more firm, under no circumstances should they leave this compartment and never take their eyes off the temperature gauges. Tony asked, "Is it always so hot down here?" As the master was heading to the hatch to leave, he turned and said, "This heat is nothing. In an hour, you'll see why no one in their right mind would ever volunteer for this job." As he was about to close the hatch, he said, "When you hear the ship's bell ring 3 times, that means you have 30 minutes to get that boiler temperature to 240 degrees, and then we sail for Brazil." As the two stood looking around their new 2-week quarters, Tony told Benito, "There's more to this job than shoveling coal into that stove." Benito replied, "I'm sure we're going to find out what's up with no one wanting to take a job just shoveling coal into a large furnace." After the two had been in the chamber for not more than 10 minutes, they started taking off their jackets and top shirts. Benito said, "This place is an oven. We haven't even ramped up the heat on the boiler yet." As they were complaining about the heat, the bell rang 3 times. Benito yelled, "No time to complain about something we can't do anything about. It's time to crank up the heat on that badass stove." Tony grabbed a shovel and wheelbarrow and headed straight for the coal pile. As he dumped the first load from the barrel on the ground in front of the boiler, he realized that a small amount wouldn't do the job, so he went off for a second batch. While Tony wheeled the barrel, Benito shoveled the coal as quickly as it was being dumped on the ground before the boiler. After 30 minutes of wheeling, dumping and shoveling, Tony removed his last shirt layer. Benito yelled, "It's starting to get as hot in this room as in that oven." He continued, "If we don't do something soon about this heat, we'll both drop dead on the floor. I think we better figure out some way to ventilate." He went on to say, "You keep wheeling and shoveling. I'm going to see what I can find to get some air in here." As Benito was nosing around, he noticed that the 4 portholes on the ship's side were all closed, not letting any ventilation into the room. The problem he faced now was opening them. He needed a ladder to reach the latch handles, keeping them closed. Scanning the entire furnace room area, he couldn't find anything tall enough to enable him to reach the latches. The only remedy left was getting Tony and standing on his shoulders so he could reach the latches. When he got back to Tony, he saw that Tony alone had not been able to keep up with the barreling and shoveling. The temperature on the gauge was falling close to the point where the stove couldn't produce enough heat to stabilize the heat level and produce the steam to propel the ship. Benito immediately grabbed the other shovel and barrel and headed for the coal pile. Frantically, they both worked to get the temperature back up to 240. Just as the two restored the dial to its safe point, the entry door to the room opened. A man carrying a box walked in and yelled, "Lunch is here. How the hell can you guys stand it in here with the room temperature this high?" Benito, without hesitation, blurted, "I see why the men working this job never return." The man said, "Why don't you boys open those portholes that will ventilate this area?" Benito explained, "The latches are too high, and there's no ladder to reach them." The man said, "That fat, lazy, no-good bum that brought you down here closed the portholes as a joke. He lets anyone dumb enough to take this job sweat their asses off before he comes back and yells, 'Why don't you open the vent windows?' He thinks it's funny listening to workers complain about the heat." The sailor introduced himself as Clancy and asked the two their names. "I'm Tony, and he's Benito, and we were shanghaied into this job to pay for our passage and papers to Brazil," Tony replied. Clancy laughed and said, "You two must have met Mr. Corleone in our port town. He's constantly drafting unsuspecting, desperate individuals to fill the boiler job for each voyage. Jose, the boiler master, is Mr. Corleone's brother-in-law. He's a long-time worker on the ship and is a good drinking buddy of the captain." He went on, "While you're down here sweating your arse off, he's drinking with the captain. Jose's job is to ensure those boilers keep steaming, so his brother-in-law sends him a couple of men every voyage. Then, later in the journey, he figures out a way to shut the boiler down by giving you two a break from the heat. He then tells the captain to cut half their pay when we arrive in Brazil. Jose and Mr. Corleone split the money, and you will leave the ship with nothing but added time to your obligation. The captain pays Jose the balance for working hard to get the steam up again." Before leaving, Clancy pointed to a pole in the corner and said, "That pole has a hook on it that will allow you to open those portholes." After Clancy left, Benito told Tony, "We're not letting that jerk get away with taking our hard-earned money. The next time that son of a bitch comes down here, you're going to play sick, and I'm going to start complaining about the same type of illness, and we'll convince him that we need to be isolated and quarantined, or he and the rest of the crew could be affected by the same plague symptoms. We'll inform him that our whole village came down with the illness before we left, and we had no signs and thought we were safe from that dreaded flu-like illness that kept the entire town bedridden for over a month." He continued, "We're sweating so hard that jerks won't be able to tell if we're sick or just exhausted. While he's here, you fall and act like you're ill, and I'll explain that those are the symptoms of the illness that affected the villagers." Tony said, "Good call, Benito. If we play this right, we may get a memorable treatment ride to Brazil." Chapter 3. Brazil. Their plan worked. Benito and Tony were kept in an isolated room for the rest of the trip. They were immediately escorted off the vessel on arrival and kept in another remote area far from everyone else. After a few days of quarantine, during which they did not show any symptoms of what everyone thought was a plague-like disease, they were taken inland to a sugar plantation, where they discovered that slavery was still in full swing. The Brazilian government had publicly informed the world that they had ended all slavery in the country for decades. The reality was that African slaves had been kept in a remote part of the country for years after declaring slavery officially over in the mid-1800s. Tony told Benito, This is what the world has condemned for over 50 years. He also told him about his grandfather's death because greedy landowners were unsatisfied with making good profits from loyal workers tending the orchards for generations. Benito replied, "Slavery doesn't always come from importing people from horrible situations. Sometimes people are convinced that a better life is waiting for them if they leave their unbearable conditions." He continued, "The elders told me how the Egyptians and the Sudanese started building pyramids. They found that rounding up slaves for the bills wasn't the key to building massive structures." Benito continued, "The slaves from Africa were unwilling to work hard and efficiently to construct the architectural monuments the pharaohs and kings intended for their lives after death. Play, the emperor of Sudan, ruled the Napitan dynasty and had a plan that enticed villagers and cities inundated with crop failures, famines and plagues to build new towns where pyramids were to be made. In these towns, there would be fields to plant crops and irrigation channels, all under the protection of the Sudan dynasty. Farmers and villagers flocked by the thousands for a chance to live in that utopian community. Once these towns were formed, the actual price of utopia was revealed. Now that the work of giving people what they needed was complete, there was a price to be paid. The people could continue with all promises while building pyramids for future generations. Sudan was so successful with this model that Egypt adopted it in the future. Tony was amazed at Benito's knowledge of the various ways of enslaving people. Benito and Tony worked in the sugarcane fields alongside other workers until their internment was complete at the end of 3 months. Finally, they were free from the bondage they'd put themselves in. Chapter 4. Ricky. Once released, they traveled back to the port city of Rio de Janeiro. Finally, they secured jobs in a fish packing house, doing what they fled Portugal for. Now, they must focus on saving money to pay for their way to America. Because of their experience in the fish industry, they were given all the extra work they could handle. Now fully employed and securing a room in the older area of town, they finally felt they had a handle on their way to America. After months saving as much as possible and securing the proper paperwork, it was time to head for America at the end of the month. With only a week until their ship sailed, the two volunteered to work 12-hour days, and it was always late in the evening before they could slowly find their way to their one room. Around midnight, they finally arrived at the front door of their room, anxious to get more than their regular 6 hours of sleep before heading back to the fish slaughterhouse. As Tony searched his pocket for the room's key, he heard a noise across the alley. He turned and asked Benito, "What is that small kid doing alone this late?" Benito replied, "I don't know and don't care. I was hoping you could open the door and let me get some sleep." Thinking about the kid, Tony opened the door and, letting Benito in, turned and started walking to see what was up with the kid being alone this late. As Tony crossed the alley, he saw a young kid standing with his hands on his hips, looking straight at Tony. The kid, not more than 3 years old, said, "Getting home late again?" Tony was stunned at how well the kid spoke. Tony returned with, "What the hell are you doing out this late without your mother?" The kid replied, "I don't have one." Tony, without hesitation, said, "Your father? Where in the hell is your dad?" "I don't have one." Irritated with the kid's answers, Tony replied, "Stop being a clever kid. Please tell me where you live and I will take you home." Tony asked before the kid could answer and said, "What is your name, little boy?" The youngster replied, "Ricky," and responded, "Are you my new dad?" Feeling he was being played with, Tony yelled, "I'm not your dad, and I need to know what you're doing in this alley without one of your parents." Ricky told him, "I have no mom or dad. They left me here a week ago and said, 'Your new parents will arrive soon.' That would be you and your friend." Tony, tired and confused, grabbed the kid by the hand and told him, "You'll stay with us tonight, and we'll see about your so-called story tomorrow." When the two entered the room, Benito woke up and spoke, "Why the hell did you bring that kid into this room?" Before Tony could speak, Ricky, facing Benito, said, "You must be my new uncle. What's your name, uncle?" Benito, getting irritated, shouted, "I'm not your uncle. And what the hell are you doing out alone?" Ricky replied, I've already explained that to Dad. Now the big question is, do you two have anything to eat here? Tony jumped in, saying to Benito, "You're not going to get anything out of him tonight. Let's give him some bread, sleep, and see what we can find out tomorrow." The next day, Benito woke from his slumber abruptly, having had a dream about the kid he'd just met. He looked around, but there was no sign of the kid anywhere in the room. He started shaking Tony to wake him up. Tony rubbed his eyes, wondering why Benito was waking up so early. Tony said, "We don't need to be at the factory earlier this morning, and I was planning to sleep longer." Benito told Tony, "The kid is gone. I guess he left." As those words came out of his mouth, Ricky crawled from under Benito's cot and said, "I'm right here, Uncle." Benito returned with, "I'm not your uncle. And what the hell are you doing under there?" Anxious to answer, Ricky said, "I was scared. And I knew that if something terrible happened, you'd be the one to save me, Uncle." Not feeling like his hero, Benito told him, "Call me Benito, and I'm not your uncle." Ricky replied, "Okay, Uncle Benito." Tony, now up and dressed, wanted to know, "Ricky, you're going to tell us the whole story of why you were out in the alley alone last night and where your parents are." With a sad face and his head looking at the floor, Ricky told them a wild story about how his parents left for America and forgot to take him with them. He said, "Now that I know you're going there, it would help me to find them if you took me." Benito, listening, screamed, "Not a chance in hell of that happening. And how do you know that we're going to America?" Ricky replied, "I heard you two talking about it the other night." Tony said, "How long have you lived in that alley?" "Your daddy Tony and I have been through hell just getting this far, and if we get caught smuggling a kid on the ship and try to get him to America without any papers, with our luck, we might end up with years of hard labor." After contemplating everything Benito said, Ricky started with, "If you let me do the talking, I'm sure there'll be no problems for you." Benito exploded, asking, "How old are you? 3 or a small 30? He said, "Let you do the talking? You're 3 years old. Who will listen to you?" Ricky answered, "Everyone. Grown-ups love to hear smart kids talk." Frustrated with the conversation, Benito told Tony to get ready to see if the neighbors knew who the kid was. Tony and Benito spent all morning asking neighbors if they had any ideas about where or to whom this kid belonged. Finally, with no one knowing about the kid's family or whereabouts, it was time for the two to head for work. As they walked out the door, they told Ricky to sit on the front porch until they returned. That evening when they returned, they saw no one sitting on the porch. Benito told Tony, "I guess he got fed up with us and found someone else to be his parents." Tony seemed sad, saying, "I hope the kid is all right, that nothing wrong happened to him." As Tony started putting the key into the door lock, he saw a note on the door saying, "Your son was wandering the street, and we took him down to police headquarters. If you would please come down and pick him up. Your fine will be 20 cucheros for the offense of abandoning a child. You will have to pay immediately or be arrested until you can see the judge." Benito shouted, "That kid's going to get us thrown in prison before we can sail out of this place." Tony said, "I'm not sure they will let us get on that ship if they think we've abandoned the kid. They may notify the ship's captain if the kid tells them we're leaving in a few days without him." Benito said, "Let's go get him out of jail and somehow we get him on the ship. And while we're out to sea, we'll throw his young ass overboard. Then he'll be out of our hair." Tony did not like the idea. "We're going to get him, bring him back here, and find out what he wants from us. There must be a reason he has latched onto us the way he has. And besides, Benito, little guy's starting to rub off on me." Benito replied, "You're right, Tony. That little monster has outsmarted us since we found him, and has more guts than any kid I've ever met. Let's go get him and bring him with us. Tony, I don't even mind if he calls me uncle." Tony and Benito entered the police station and saw Ricky sitting on a bench. As Ricky noticed the two men entering the room, he jumped and ran across the room yelling, "Daddy, I know you and Uncle Benito would come and break me out of prison." The officer behind his desk asked if one of the two was his father. Tony said reluctantly, "That would be me." The officer starts on, "If you hadn't shown up when you did, we would have had a warrant out for your arrest. The boy told the officer that brought him in that you two always left him alone when you left for work. That is inexcusable, and if it were up to me, I would give you jail time. I'm letting you two off the hook because the kid told me your wife died and that no one was around to help with the kid. This time, I'm only going to fine you 20 cruceros, a small price for the agony you've put the poor child through." Tony quickly paid the officer the 20 cruceros. After receiving the money, the officer warned the two that if they heard of any other nonsense about abandoning this kid, it was heading to jail for the two of you. As the three were leaving the police headquarters, Tony, holding Ricky's hand, asked the boy, "Why did you tell those officers a story like that? You could have gotten us in a lot of trouble." Ricky responded, saying, "Dad, I had to do something drastic, or you and Uncle Benito would have left me behind." Tony told Benito we need to figure out how to get this kid on the ship with us. If we abandon him again, we may never have a chance to sail to America. Ricky, looking up at Tony, said, "I guess we're family now. You, me, and Uncle Benito. The three unstoppable guys." Benito laughed, chuckled, saying, "You're a funny kid. But if you're going to hang around with us, we need an understanding right now. Your made-up dad and I will take you with us only to save our skins from being thrown in jail. But if you're going to come with us, we need assurance from you that there will be no more tricks. We are your boss, not you of us. Get it, kid?" Benito looked at Tony and said, "Can you believe this? I'm bargaining with a 3-year-old kid like he should have something over us." Tony replied, "If you haven't noticed, Benito, he's beaten us to the punch every time. It's not a question of us handling him. We must be alert for what he might have up his sleeve next." 3 days passed, and they were up early, preparing for the voyage to the new land. Tony told Benito, "Because we don't have papers for Ricky to get into America, maybe we can find someone who can forge papers like Mr. Corleone, who falsified documents for us." Benito said, "That's not a bad idea, but how will we find anyone like that this late? The ship leaves in 6 hours. Ricky, listening, interrupted, saying, "I don't need papers. I'm an underage kid, and I'll explain everything if you let me do the talking." Tony laughed, saying, "You don't say anything after we get off the ship." Benito stopped Tony and said, "You know, Tony, this kid has outsmarted us and the police every step of the way. I, for one, want to hear how he plans to pull this one off." Tony came back with, "You can't be serious. The kid is only 3, and no one will listen to him." Benito replied, "Tony, they may not let us in if we get caught with forged papers when we get to Ellis Island." "Okay, Benito, we'll try it. But if it doesn't work, we'd better have a backup plan." Chapter 5. Passage Seeking. There were no problems getting on the ship and heading to America. The voyage went smoothly, and as they docked, Tony nervously said to Ricky, "I hope you know what you're doing." Ricky turned to him and said, "No problem, Dad. This one's in the bag." The three stood in line for over an hour and finally got to the customs officer, who instructed everyone to have their papers ready to be inspected. Tony and Benito handed the inspector their papers, but the inspector asked about the kid's papers. He was a big, burly-looking man with an intense German accent. Ricky spoke up and asked the inspector in German, "Do you speak German?" The man replied in German, "Yes, I do, young man." Ricky continued in German, "I'm here with my dad and uncle, trying to find my mother. A Russian sailor kidnapped her and took her to this country. My uncle Benito came with us because he is a mighty man who can dispose of the Russian madman and free my mum. Can you please help us and tell us how we can get a place to stay in this town?" The inspector, sympathetic to the young kid's situation, said in German, "I think I can let you through undocumented." Now speaking in English, Ricky told his dad and uncle that the inspector could help them. Tony looked at Benito, stunned that the kid spoke another language. Benito asked Tony, "What other surprises does this kid have up his sleeve that we don't know about?" As the three left the inspection station, the inspector told Tony, "Your son is an exceptional kid. I have never known a child that young to be so smart. The first thing you need to do is go downtown and exchange your Brazilian cruzeros for dollars. No one will accept Brazilian currency in this country. I also want to warn you that New York is dangerous, and it will be challenging to find a job if you're not Irish or Italian. Please consider moving to another part of the country." As they walked away, Ricky turned to the inspector and said to him in German, "Lose some weight, you're too fat. Lose weight, you're getting too fat to do your job." In return, the inspector starts shouting angrily in German, Benito asked, "What the hell did you say to that guy?" Ricky said, "I told him he should lose some weight. You're getting too fat to do your job." Benito wanted to know what the inspector said in return. Ricky replied, "He told me that your two buddies needed to return and show him your papers again." Listening to their conversation, Tony yelled, "Let's get out of here before the guard calls the police on us." After he ran a few blocks from the inspection station, they stopped and caught their breath. Tony asked Ricky why he said that to the inspector. Ricky replied, "When you're as fat as that guy, it's only good manners to warn them about the consequences of being overweight on one's love life." After hearing Ricky's response, Tony was speechless and almost fell over. The three heard screaming and yelling as they walked a few more blocks. When they turned the corner, they saw two men fighting. One pulled a knife and cut the other person. Not wanting to get involved in that action, they walked quickly to the next block. Two more men were fighting there. The same fight scene continued as they moved from one block to another. Benito let Tony know, "This place seems like a war zone. I'm not sure it would be safe to stay in this town. Did you notice all the signs that said only Italians were allowed?" When they finally got into the city, the signs started saying, "No Italians allowed, Irish only in this part of town." Tony told Benito, "Now I know what the inspector said about not staying in this city." As they kept walking the streets, they realized the city was divided into ethnic areas. There were Polish areas, Jewish-only areas, and Irish and Italian neighborhoods separated by knife fights and gunshots. Because they were not allowed in boarding houses, the three had to settle for a small corner of an alley filled with other homeless individuals for the night. As the three huddled together in a small corner at the end of the alley, Benito said, "With all the excitement and dreams about coming to this country, we're worse off than if we'd stayed in Portugal." Tony said, "There must be something better than this filthy, dangerous town. I'm not sure what part of America we will end up in, but it's got to be better than New York City." As the three held on to each other to keep warm, Tony told Ricky, "It's good to have you with us, and you can call me Dad all you want." Ricky leaned closer to Tony and said, "Don't ask why I chose you as my dad. You will find out when it's time for you to know." Not sure what Ricky was talking about, Tony asked, "Did your mum abandon you and run off with a Russian?" "No, Dad," Ricky replied. "You're not ready to understand the whole story." Tony, Ricky, and Benito slept in the alley, woke up the following day, and discussed where to find a job and a place to stay. Chapter 6: Oklahoma. While Tony and Benito were discussing the best area to search for work, Ricky wandered off to the end of the alley. Tony couldn't see him and started looking around. Benito tapped him on the shoulder and said, "If you're looking for the kid, he's at the other end of the alley talking to a group of people like us." Tony went to the group and told Ricky to stop bothering them, to stay with me. A lady in the group told Tony, "Your son is quite an intelligent youngster. He tells me that you are homeless and without work. You're wasting your time if you think you'll find a job in this town. My husband and I have been here for 2 weeks looking, and every time a job opens, they want to know where you're from. Unless you get lucky, you can start looking, but you won't find anything in this town." Ricky pulled on Tony's shirt and said, "These people are heading for Oklahoma. Maybe we can go with them." Tony asked the lady her name and what was in Oklahoma. The lady, whose name was Alice, replied, "Oklahoma is not a state yet, but it will be soon. It's now part of Texas and is the only place in the Midwest where you can homestead land." Ricky interrupted again, saying, "Dad, that's the place for us. If we get some land, I have many ideas for growing corn, carrots, and raising chickens." Tony thanked Alice, returned to Benito, and told him what she said about Oklahoma. After Benito spent over an hour talking to Alice and her husband Ralph, he returned and said to Tony and Ricky, "Oklahoma is the place for us. Now we need to find a way to get there." Tony told Ricky that good news had been hard to come by, so today is a good day to celebrate. Tony asked Ricky when his birthday was, and Ricky replied, "Today is my birthday, and I'm now 4 years old." "Ricky, don't start lying about things like that. One thing we Portuguese don't like is stories that aren't true. If you begin telling little lies now, you will tell big ones when you're older." "When you and your Uncle Benito said to the ship's captain that you had the plague on board the vessel from Portugal, was that lying, Dad?" Tony was in shock, wondering how Ricky knew about faking sickness on the way from Portugal. He thought maybe Benito had said something about it to the kid, Or possibly they had mentioned something about how they got out of the boiler room. Tony asked Ricky, "Did Uncle Benito tell you about when we were aboard the ship?" Ricky replied, "No, Dad. I knew about that little lie before I met you and Uncle Benito." Ricky changed the subject, saying, "Dad, it's good to be 4. 3 is just too young and immature." Ralph, Alice's husband, walked up to Benito and Tony and said, "If you 3 want to follow us, we're going to the rail yard, where they ship cattle from Texas and Oklahoma to New York. These cattle cars bring in cattle and leave empty. If we hang around the rail yard until they unload, we should be able to jump in one of the empty cars and hitch a ride to Oklahoma. It's almost a 2-day hike to the rail yard from here, and we don't know when the cattle shipment is due, so the sooner we head out, the better chance we have of getting in one of those empty cars." Benito said, "You let us know when you're ready, and we'll follow." Tony and Benito grabbed all their belongings and headed down the alley to ensure they were there when the Smiths were ready to head out. Ricky jumped into the conversation and told them, "Finally, you 2 have come up with a good idea. Let's get going before the train leaves without us." He continued, "Oklahoma's always been the place I want to call home." Tony asked Benito, "Is Oklahoma the Smiths' idea, or did the kid always know where we would end up?" As they walked, Tony told Benito, "Whenever I ask Ricky questions about things, he seems to know the answers before they happen. He keeps telling me that I'm not ready to understand yet. There's something about him that he's holding back from us. He's just too smart to be whatever young age he claims to be." Tony continued as they walked, "I hope we're not too late to catch the train that's unloaded the last herd." Upon entering the holding area, they were confronted by a club-wielding guard who yelled at the group, "You're not allowed in this area, and if you don't leave, it's off to jail for the bunch of you." As they returned to the cover of the trees, 4, 5, and 6 additional guards with clubs started heading toward the group. While they were back in the tree area, Benito said, "Those boys mean business, and there's no way we can head to the train cars through there." After a couple of hours in the trees with no solution to finding a way around the guarded area, Ralph suggested they wait until nightfall and see if they might be able to slip past those paid thugs. While pondering their next move, a man dragging a duffel bag with what seemed to be his entire belongings walked into the area where the group was seated. As he approached, Ralph yelled at the drifter that there was no way he would get through if he were trying to get to the train. The man said, "I'm not going that way. I'm skirting the tree line and heading to the bridge, where the train slows down before crossing. That's the easiest way to board one of the empty cars." Benito asked, "Do you mind a little company? It's a free country. Come along if you like. But you'd better get moving because the train will leave in about half an hour. Are you sure you want to try boarding a moving train with those little kids?" While walking, Benito asked the stranger his name. The fellow said, "Charlie." Benito continued to ask him how he knew so much about train schedules. Charlie replied, "I come into town daily, riding with a car full of cattle, and head home each evening, all in the comfort of an empty boxcar." Charlie went on to say that if they tried to get the train before it pulled out, those men with clubs would beat them so bad they wouldn't be able to crawl away. "We'll follow your lead, Charlie, if you don't mind." Charlie started walking faster, telling the rest of the group, "You better keep up, or we won't be in time to catch our ride." Just as the group got to the bridge, they could hear the train's whistle blowing in the distance. Standing before the bridge, Charlie told Tony and Benito to throw the kid in the car first, then they should jump aboard. He added, "You better leap just right, or the kid is gone and you are left behind." As the train approached, Charlie yelled, "Wait for one of the later cars so the engineer can't see you aboard." After what seemed like the middle of the passing cars went by, Charlie screamed, "Get aboard, the kid first." Tony hoisted Ricky, threw him to the car's center, grabbed the door, and pulled himself aboard. Benito ran to the open door and managed to pull himself in with the other 2. Once secure aboard, Tony looked back to see how Alice, Ralph, and the kids were doing. He saw them standing alongside the train, not trying to get aboard. That was the last time the 3 ever saw the family again. Miraculously, Charlie grabbed hold of the back of the car where the 3 were. As the train continued, Charlie pulled himself across the side of the cattle car and entered the opening where Tony, Benito, and Ricky were. While the train steamed down the tracks, Benito asked Charlie what was in the bag he threw on before they got on. Charlie told him that because he could not secure a job in the city, he went daily to the back of fancy restaurants, scavenging what they threw away and bringing back enough food to feed his family. Ricky, who had been surprisingly silent throughout the train boarding, asked Charlie, "What kind of goodies do you find behind fancy restaurants? Would you like a taste of some goodies in the bag, little guy?" Ricky spoke up, saying, "I'm hungry. I'll eat anything." Charlie reached into the bag and started pulling out some of the gourmet specials. He said, "First, we have what the rich enjoy most, small jars of caviar." Ricky spoke, saying, "They look like little balls." "No, just fish eggs." "No thanks, sir." Charlie reached in again, pulled out a box and said, "How about steamed clams, steamed mussels, or even something they call calamari, that would be cooked squid?" Ricky shook his head to all of those. "How about this then?" Charlie reached into the bag, pulled out a large loaf of baked bread, and divided it up among the four of them. While the three were consuming their bread, Charlie pulled out a small jar of caviar, spread it all over his bread, and said, "If you can't be rich, it's nice to eat like you are." Ricky said, "You are one funny guy, Charlie." Charlie stood up and said, "You haven't seen anything yet." He pulled out of his pocket 3 small balls and started juggling them. Ricky began to clap and laugh, and as happy as the 3 were watching Charlie juggling the 3 balls, he pulled out the 4th and 5th balls and put them in play as he danced around the car. After Charlie finished his routine, he sat down with the guys and explained that he was in the circus before meeting his wife and settling down. As he told the story of his circus days, the train started slowing down and Charlie said, "This is my stop, and I must get off and head home." Tony, Benito and Ricky thanked him for a memorable trip. Charlie's last words to the 3 were, "Have an excellent trip to Oklahoma, you 3 Okies." Chapter 7. House to Home. After a 30-minute stop for water, the train started pulling away from the water station. Once the train pulled away from Charlie's watering hole, there was only one other stop for water, and none before reaching Oklahoma City. It was late in the evening when the train pulled into the station, where cattle corrals were filled with cattle waiting for their return to what Benito called a dangerous hellhole of a city. After jumping down from the boxcar and heading out of the area, a guard screamed at the 3 to get the hell out of the area. Benito shouted to Tony, "I hope this town isn't as crazy as the last one we left." After walking a couple of miles, Tony spotted a boarding house. As they approached, there was a vacancy sign. While Benito and Ricky waited outside, Tony entered to secure a room for the night. After paying, he asked the clerk, "Do you know where I might find the place where one might apply for government land?" The clerk replied, "There is a place, not sure of its location, but it's called the Territorial Land Resource and Development Department. They're a U.S. government department that sells and sometimes allows homesteads for farming use only." Tony went outside to let Benito know that he had rented a room for the evening and had a lead on where to apply for homestead land. Ricky said, "Dad, chickens are the ticket to get started on our new land." Tony replied, "We haven't even secured the land yet, and you're telling us how to start farming." Ricky returned, "We'll get the land, and raising and selling chickens is the best way to start our farm." As they walked upstairs to the 2nd floor and looked for their room at the end of the hall, Ricky insisted that chicken was the best way to start making a profit. The next day, the 3 woke up early and asked if anyone knew where the Territorial Land Resource and Development Department was. One man directed them to the town centre, where many government buildings existed. After walking for about 20 minutes, they saw different government buildings. Tony entered an office and asked which building was where they could apply for homestead land. The secretary directed him to the correct building just 1 block away. They walked in and asked the secretary how to find out about homesteading land. She told them that they would need to make an appointment and provide information about the parcels they planned to apply for and their intended land use. She also mentioned that the available land was primarily for livestock use and in areas without access to water wells and electric power. Ricky suggested that chickens were livestock, and Tony agreed that the kid knew what he was talking about. The secretary provided them with maps of available homestead land areas. Afterward, Benito suggested that they buy a horse and wagon to explore the land. Tony agreed, and they went to secure a room for the rest of the week. While paying for the additional night, Tony asked the clerk, Michael, where they could buy a horse and wagon. Michael directed them to a stable about half a mile away. Tony told Benito about the stable and suggested they head there immediately to secure what they needed. Benito agreed, and asked Ricky if he liked the plan. Tony asked why he asked Ricky's opinion, to which Benito replied that the kid had been right about everything so far, and it might be wise to ensure they were doing things correctly. Tony thought it was ridiculous, because Ricky was only 4 years old, but Ricky defended himself, saying he knew more than they thought. About an hour later, the three arrived at the stables and searched for the right horse to pull their wagon. Tony exclaimed, "This one seems strong enough to pull a wagon full of goods." Ricky approached the horse and said, "You must have a good eye for horses. This one's the one for us." "I'm sure glad you agree, because you know a lot about horses." Feeling slightly insulted, Ricky said, "That horse is about 4 years old, about my age, and she's the most muscular horse on the lot. You can tell by the bone structure in her legs and the muscles in her shoulders." At that moment, the stable salesman approached Tony and said, "I see you're interested in Wanda. She's the most muscular horse in the yard, and at 4 years old, she'll last quite a few years." Tony was once again stunned at Ricky's knowledge of almost everything. Tony looked at Ricky and said, "Good call. And we need to talk about how you knew that horse's age." After securing the wagon and all the necessary supplies, they returned to their room to get a good night's sleep. The following day, they were anxious to start scouting out the land. However, when Benito headed out the door, he found the horse and wagon were missing. He looked around all sides of the building, but couldn't find any sign of them. Benito went charging back inside and headed upstairs, yelling for Tony to come down and help look for the horse and wagon. Once outside, they ran in both directions, looking around adjacent buildings for any sign of the rig. As the two walked back to the front of the boarding house, Ricky sat on the front steps. When they approached him, Benito frustratedly shouted, "That's the end of any hope of getting our land." Sitting calmly on the steps, Ricky said, "If you give me a moment, I have my brain focusing on tracking down the sneaky guy that got away with our horse and wagon." Tony and Benito looked at each other, wondering what this kid was talking about. Without hesitation, Ricky said, "The horse and wagon went back to the stables where we bought them from." Still wondering what he was talking about, Benito insisted that the horse and wagon was stolen. Ricky said, "No, we must go there and bring them back here." Not knowing what else to do, Tony thought they should check it out. As the three approached the stables, Wanda was tied up out front and waiting for her new owners to come and get her. Shocked, Tony told Benito, "This kid is not normal, and I, for one, need to get to the bottom of how he knows what he does." As the three approached their horse and wagon, the horse salesman walked out of the sales office and said, "Your horse must have come untied and didn't know what to do, so she wandered back here." The man also said, "If you don't have any place to keep the girl for 25 cents a night, we'll watch her down here." When the three retrieved Wanda and headed out to examine the land, Tony asked Ricky, "How did you know Wanda went back to the sales office?" Ricky tried to avoid answering and said, "All horses, when left untied, head back to the place they know the best." As they left town on a dirt road leading to the charted land on the map, the road suddenly turned into more of a trail than a road. Benito said, "Now I see why settlers have never occupied this land. It's nothing more than sagebrush and dirt." Ricky said, "The land out here is perfect. We can live out here, raise chickens, and sell eggs and roosters in town daily. Then in the spring, we can grow vegetables and sell them all summer long." Tony returned with, "The vegetable thing might be a problem. There's no water in this area, according to the land management department." "They could be wrong, Dad. Let's look around and see what we can find as a water source." Tony explained, "Water does not grow on trees. It's either there or not. If it's there, I'll find it, Dad, and show those so-called water experts who have no idea how to find water." After driving to where the trail ended, they wondered how they could tell where 90 acres started or ended. Tony and Benito exited the wagon and started walking the land, trying to make heads or tails of what direction to start pacing off what would be 90 acres. Ricky spoke up and told them, "An acre has no definite shape. Therefore, any area measurement qualifies as an acre." Tony and Benito were again shocked as Ricky started explaining an acre measurement. He began with, 1 acre is equivalent to about 43,000 square feet. If you begin pacing it off, given one pacing is equivalent to a yard, that distance would require 4,800 paces, divided in half in each direction, and you have an acre. Ricky said they would need 3 days out there and about 100 wooden stakes to find their 90 acres. Tony and Benito were speechless after hearing Ricky effortlessly spout out those figures. Tony yelled at Ricky, "Benito and I have had enough of you being more intelligent than anyone we've ever met. We want to know who you are and what you want from us." "I know I shouldn't have told you how to determine how to lay out 90 acres, but I knew you wouldn't have ever figured it out yourselves. Ricky, if you want me to be your dad, you'd better let us know what's up with you being the most intelligent person on this planet." Ricky faced the dilemma of Tony and Benito demanding answers about his superintelligence, and he knew he had to act fast. He decided to let them in on his secret, but he wouldn't tell them that they wouldn't remember anything the next day and think that they'd figured out the measurement themselves. Ricky would plant a subliminal message in their minds that Benito was the one that figured it all out. This was one of the rare, but not the only times Ricky would use this kind of power to divert the curiosity of the mind to question his superintelligence. After waking up the next day, Tony told Benito how smart he was for figuring out how to claim 90 acres mathematically. Benito thanked Tony for the gesture and suggested they go back to the supply store and pick up the 100 stakes needed to mark their 90 acres. Ricky was confident they would never remember him blurting out those exact acre measurements. Now he had to figure out how to find water on land with none. After an exhausting 3 days of staking out the new land, they headed back to the Territorial Land Resource and Development Office to claim it. After showing the staked land area on the department's map, they were finally given a permit for homestead ownership. Now, with the rules of ownership, they had 1 year to build a permanent residence. Tony suggested they buy a large tent to house them while building a small structure to shelter them while they developed the property. Still concerned about water, Benito said, "If we don't find a water source, we'll be wasting our time building anything." Ricky became more cautious about divulging his constantly developing mental capacity. He needed to find a way to locate water without making it seem unnatural. After the three arrived at the property, Ricky started roaming the land for any sign of water. He figured that if he could find any sign of living vegetation, there must be a water source below. Walking for over an hour, he encountered a large mound of dirt at the side of their property and discovered bushes growing on it. As he walked closer, he realized he was over the property line of the 90 acres. Being far from their property and finding the first sign of water, he realized it would be on the adjacent property if there were water. As he approached the bushes, he knelt, putting his head close to the ground, and could hear water noises below the surface. He could confirm that water was less than 30 feet below the surface. Ricky thought quickly, knowing that the discovery of water on this desolate land would bring a stampede of others trying to claim the land. He ran as fast as he could up to Tony and Benito and said, "Dad, I found what I believe is a water source. I want you both to come with me, and I'll show you the spot." Benito and Tony, excited about any possibility of water, followed Ricky back to the site. As they crossed the stakes of the property and approached the growing vegetation, Benito yelled at Ricky saying, "I hope you realize that's not our property, and if we let anyone know about any prospect of finding water, there will be a stampede to claim this land." Tony agreed with Benito, saying, "It looks like we staked the wrong spot." Ricky thought quickly and yelled, "If all this land is worthless, why don't we stake out this section and see if we can claim it also?" Tony said, "That's a good idea, Ricky. You're such a smart kid." Ricky just smiled and thanked his dad for the compliment. Once the additional stakes were in place, the three headed back to the Land Resource Office and asked about the other land. The land manager told them that the additional parcel was possible due to the lack of interest from any other land seekers. Once the additional 90 acres were secured, Tony, Benito, and Ricky returned to the property and started digging their well.
End of section 1. Please scan the next QR code or click the video on the screen.